In this case, Vance's statements about China is also interesting. I watched a video of him on Fox News Sunday, and he supported first of all, unconditionally arming Israel and encircling China. He argues that the EU should be made to dump more money into Ukraine, here echoing Trump's view, so that the US can focus on preparing for war with China. Then I watched him speaking I think this was in the House or in the Senate. He said, quote, "The Chinese have a foreign policy of building roads and bridges and feeding the poor." Like,
This is very evil.
yeah, I mean,
How dare they?
those are two contradictory statements from his side. If the Russian foreign policy is based on building roads and infrastructure, why would the United States want to encircle China?
Chinese, yeah. Well, because we know the reason. The reason is the old reason, which is that the United States elite, and in this respect, they still all think the same way, does not want to allow a regional hegemon to arise anywhere on the globe, literally. It's insane, but that's their policy. But it's not about, we've talked about this before, it's not about the fact that they feel challenged for primacy. They do that too, but that isn't their most acute problem. The most acute problem is that they don't want any power to have like a region around it on the globe that they can use as a resource to challenge them or to resist them, and especially not in Eurasia. But what the United States is overlooking is that they're pushing the Russians and the Chinese together. They've done this enormously. You've recently seen it as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting in Astana in Kazakhstan.
Yeah.
And if the Chinese and the Russians stay together, then the United States will not get a foot on the ground in Eurasia again. This game will be over if they stay together. And I think one of the games that some people, maybe Vance, maybe some others, are already thinking about is doing a reverse Kissinger, where they want to rebuild relationships with the Russians and then split the Russians off the Chinese, the way that Kissinger and Nixon used the Chinese against the Soviets in the old Cold War. But my guess is that Beijing and Moscow really know this sort of routine now, and they won't fall for it. They'd be very, very stupid, because American power in Eurasia only functions if they can divide these two. If America cannot divide the Russians from the Chinese, they will not prevail in Eurasia. This whole thing is not going to work.
I think it's too late now to draw a division between Russia and China in this case. There are many layers of the relationship between China and Russia. We're speaking about grand strategy. Both sides have become mature enough to understand the mentality, let's say, or the strategy behind these foreign policies of the US in Eurasia. Secondly, the high level of economic and energy deals among each other. Three, mutual interests in many of the regions, especially, for example, in the Middle East, stabilizing the region and investing in this region and making profits mutually. And three, this was traditionally, it was important, like the chemistry between leaders, and you can see that these two leaders trust each other, and how do they treat each other and speak between each other, something that you miss in Europe or in the United States, to see two gentlemen, like really, like there is a gentleman agreement, no, in the West now, even if you sign it and submit it in the UN Security Council, they could just tear it apart,
But this is how we've approached the Russians when the Russians started rightly saying, you promised us no NATO expansion. One of our arguments was, why we never put that into a treaty. I mean, where's good faith? If you talk to people like that, then you shouldn't be astonished that they become your enemies. And the Russians developed a term for that. They called it nedogovorospodobny, which means not capable of agreement, by which they mean if you're dealing with a person where you know their word doesn't count, that's what that means. And this is exactly what we have become to them. And many other states and statesmen, and you're absolutely right about this, still are like that with each other. They still have a degree of good faith. And there's one other thing that I would add to what we were talking about, which is when Washington in the 70s, right, managed to mobilize to an extent the Chinese against the Soviets, there was something between the Soviets and the Chinese that was unresolved, which was a struggle over primacy in what they saw as like the communist camp or something, right? Who is the biggest communist power? Now, when you look at Russia and China now, they are not struggling. They are far too smart. It is true that in some ways, Russia is actually junior power now, and China is the senior power. But look at the picture. They are not fighting over this. The Chinese are smart enough, they're wise enough not to be oppressive, not to sort of play their cards too hard. And the Russians are smart enough to actually live with this and work with it. And they're not fighting over this, and they're not fighting over some sort of primacy in Eurasia either. There are these Western fantasies. Whenever there is a crisis somewhere in Central Asia, right? You know this too. Somebody writes in Foreign Affairs or Foreign Policy, now the Chinese and the Russians are going to come to blows, blah, blah, blah. Nothing, nada. They're far too smart for this. They also have learned. And another thing they've learned, and I think you've already said this, but let me just underline it, is, look, the Americans have playing their games now for decades and decades. Do they not understand that most people in the world now understand how they work? The Americans are not that original. I mean, the way they cheat, the way they use power, the way they use coups, the way they subvert, it's always the same. And by now, all of this is old. And the Russians and the Chinese look at this and now we're not going to fall for your shit again.